Hey everybody, today I want to talk about the pVortex node. So this is a node that exists in the particle emitter system, and this is really the start of a series that I want to do that just explores each one of these nodes in detail. And the idea here is to sort of poke the node a little bit and sort of see what it does, because the documentation makes a lot more sense after you kind of have played with things. Let me put it that way. So I'd just like to point out that I'm by no means any expert. I'm really just sort of playing with these little things and sort of seeing what happens, and some pretty neat effects kind of come out as a result of that. So if there's some other really interesting uses for this Vortex node, please let me know in the comments, and maybe I can look at doing a tutorial on something a little more specific. So the goal here is really not for me to be saying here's how this thing shall be used. It's really a conversation sort of back and forth to say, okay, here's what I've observed that these tools can do, and let's sort of see what we can build. Alright, so let's get into it. So what we're going to do is start off with a new fusion composition. So I'm going to grab this fusion composition, drag it down here, and we're going to head right into fusion. There we go. We only have our media out, and we want to set up our very basic particle system. So we're going to start with our p-emitter node over here. Then we're going to bring down a p-render over here. We're going to also bring in a 3D renderer over here because we want this all to be in 3D. And then we're going to hook all these up. Now, when you take a look, click on your p-render, and you'll come over to output mode here. It's just, if it's set to 2D, switch that to 3D. And we want it to come into this node here, and then we hook all these up, and sure enough, we have our very basic particle system ready to roll right there. Before we go any further, let's bring a camera in, because we're going to be using a camera because it's going to really help us look at different angles to really understand what's happening when we bring in our Vortex node. So let's bring that in. Camera's right over here, 3D camera, and we're going to hook that up to our render node. Not our 3D render node, that's over here. This is just our regular p-render node. So now we're going to click on the camera, we're going to drag it up to this viewport over here. What we see right now in this viewport here, I'm going to make this single view right now, and I'm going to give us a little bit more space. So right now we only see our camera in here. If we want to see our particles also, we're going to have to take our p-emitter and drag it up. Now you can see the particles in there. And we look that our camera is sort of, the lens of our camera is essentially right in the middle of this blob. So we want to grab our camera, which is over here, and we're just going to drag it back a little bit so we can sort of see things normally. And I'm going to go back in a 2-up display here, and I'm going to take the media out, and I'm going to put it over on the right, and I'm going to come up to here, and I'm going to take this checker underlay, and I'm going to click on that so we have a black background instead of the checker underlay. So now we can see things from the camera's perspective, as well as we can sort of rotate around the viewport here. So Alt middle mouse button lets you rotate like this. Holding just the middle mouse button kind of lets you pan around like this. So I'm going to click on the p-emitter here. I'm just going to move things around, and I'm going to push D, and that should center this in the screen. Okay, so if you ever want to center your selected object, just press the D key after you have something selected. And again, I hold Alt, and then that sort of locks this right to the middle of the screen. So when I rotate around that particular object. It's pretty handy. So to keep things simple, we're going to change the emitter region. To do that, we select our p-emitter over here. We come up to region. That's this over here. Now region is defining where the particles are being emitted from. So in this case, our region is this sphere, so that's where all the particles are burst from. I don't want to use a sphere, I want to use a rectangle. I'm going to select rectangle, and here we go. So now when I play this, all these particles are just sort of born in this rectangle. They're not really moving anywhere right now. Okay, that's all well and good. So we'll stop that, and I just want to lay this flat down. So we're going to come down to X rotation, and we're going to put 90 degrees. Now we've sort of flattened that out. Oh, it looks like our z-axis is pointing down now. Maybe we want to point that up. So I'm going to go with negative 90 degrees. There we go. So let's keep it nice and simple like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to bring in our Vortex node right now. So I'm going to take the p-emitter and drag this back a little bit. Right click here. Or actually, I won't right click. I'm going to hold Shift spacebar. It'll bring up our select tool. And I'm going to type PV for particle vortex. And that comes up here. I'll select that and I'll click add. That adds it right over here. I'm going to drag it on this line here, and I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and when I see that line sort of come up underneath, that means it's going to sort of snap into place. So I let go of things, and now we put our vortex in line. So let's take a look at what's going on. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to take this vortex and I'm going to move it up here. I just want to move it out of the way a little bit. Now that we have this going, we can start to understand how this Vortex system works. So what I'm going to do first, though, is I'm going to go back to a 1-up display over here, single viewer, and then I'm going to click on this little node up here, this quad view, and that's going to set up a bunch of different orthographic views as well as a perspective view. So let's just take a few minutes just to get this set up exactly how we want. So the top view, so that's okay. So I'm going to keep this as top view. I'm going to kind of zoom in on that. This one over here, I'm going to change this to front view, let's say. So this is looking in the XY plane. I'm going to change this bottom one here to perspective. So this is the one where we'll be able to sort of zoom around on. And then this one here, we'll go with right. And we'll zoom in a little bit here. Okay, what I want to do is I just want to make things a little bit easier to see. So right now these particles are all point particles. I want to make them a little bit larger. So in order to see them a bit better, I'm going to come over to pEmitter. I'm going to come over here to style. So region, remember, defines where the particles are coming from. Style defines what the particles look like. So the style here is point, and I'm going to click the drop down and I'm going to pick blob. What I'm going to do though is I'm just going to stop my animation right now because sometimes, and I'm also going to save, because sometimes when you switch to point, which is very simple for your computer to handle, to something a little more complex, you can cause a crash here. So I'm going to pick blob, and then we see these blobs show up sort of really quite large. So I'm going to come down to the size control, and I'm going to bring that size down considerably. And there we go. So I selected 0.005. That seems to give a little bit of volume, but it's still running pretty smooth. Our playback is running at full steam, 24 frames per second. So in terms of what controls sort of show up in here, if I select the Vortex and the emitter down here, well then both the controls show up on screen. So I can see the region where my particles are coming from, as well as I can see this sphere of influence, I guess, if you want to call it, from the pVortex node. Okay, so let's start looking at things here. So we got our Vortex node and it's selected up here. So let's start diving in. What does this Vortex thing do? So if we take a look at the controls up top here, first we have our controls. These are our main Vortex controls. This is where we're going to be spending all our time today. And so there's really not a lot there, but let's dig into these sort of one by one to sort of see what happens. So first, let's take a look at our translation. So our X offset, Y offset, and Z offset. So we've changed our Y offset. That's when we just move this sort of up and down a little bit, right? So we just moved it up to some random place. So whatever value is fine for now. And our offset for X and Z are set to 0. So all that is really a translation in space. So that section, pretty easy. Let's concentrate on these right here. So strength and power. So in order to sort of see what each one of these does, let's sort of zero one of them out and look at them one at a time. So let's take our power and we're going to bring that down to 0. Okay, so what happened there? It looks like these things kind of sped up a little bit as far as how fast they're kind of going around the circle. So let's leave power for a moment and we'll just take a look at strength. Let's just play with strength for a bit. Right now it's set to 1. So let's set that to 0 just to kind of confirm that that's not doing anything. So that's basically turned off our Vortex. So that's obviously not really that fun. So we'll turn that back to 1. And we're going to answer the question as to why things are kind of going this way in a little bit. We'll get back to that in a second. So let's just take a look at this. So what this Vortex node is sort of supposed to do is imagine these particles are sort of caught up in this swirling vortex that you'd see here. And you can kind of, by looking at the particles, kind of envision what that sort of vortex would look like if you were able to see it. So let's play with strength a little bit. So right now, I have my animation running up to about 120 frames here. So it looks like the speed of these particles at the end of 120 frames makes it up to, you know, roughly around here. So let's just play with the strength and see what it does. I'm going to crank it up to 2. Okay, we see the particles are moving faster, and we make it all the way around to here. So the vortex is sort of working harder in a sense. So each of these particles is caught up in a larger storm as we increase the strength, so to speak. Okay, so we're at 2. So what would happen if we set that to -2? Well, we're going in the opposite direction. So negative values are really just changing the direction of where this vortex is sort of swirling. Okay, so that's all well and good. So let's go up to 5, for example. Really crank this up. Okay, very cool. Now we're getting somewhere. First of all, we've created a ring of particles. So there's thousands of uses for something like this. But in any case, it looks pretty neat here. So as far as this setup is concerned, what the strength does is it effectively control the speed of these particles here, and is doing that indirectly by changing sort of the strength of the vortex, if you can think about it that way. Let's try a little experiment. Let's take this pEmitter node, and I'm going to duplicate that, and I'm going to create another one. So what I'm going to come down, I'm going to click on pEmitter, I'm going to Control-C to copy it, I'm going to click in this empty space, and I'm not going to push Control-V, I'm going to push Control-Shift-V. And that's going to create what's called an instance. And an instance is effectively a direct copy of this first emitter. So anything I change in this emitter will change in this emitter and vice versa. So to make this a little more useful, we want to de-instance some of the parameters. And one of the parameters that I want to de-instance, and by de-instance what I mean is sort of decouple it from this first emitter node here. So let me show you what I mean. Here's the instance. So I select this instance of the P emitter and I want to change its position. So to do that, we come to the region and it's going to be this translation here, this XYZ. So we want to right click on this and we want to go de-instance this translate group. So what that means is this translate group here. So these three values here are now independent from this one here. Okay, so now we have our instance created. So we want to raise this up a little bit. So we're going to take our Y offset and we're just going to bump it up a little bit. Now, right now we see, here's our new emitter up here. I'm going to select them both so we can keep them in the perspective view. This one's not emitting anything. And the reason is because it's not hooked up to our particle system. So I'm going to just bring this back a little bit, delete this line here by double clicking on it, join these two together. That's going to create a merge, and then I bring this back into our Vortex node here. And now we see we have these two rings. So one thing to take a note of, let's focus on this top view here. So at the start of the animation, you can see these two rings kind of racing around, and it looks like nobody wins the race. It's kind of a tie, right? The outer ring is moving a little bit faster because it's traveling around a larger radius, but they both look like they end back at the starting point at roughly the same time. And the reason that is because our power for this vortex is set to 0. So think of strength as how much this vortex node is going to affect our particles, but power is related to how far away the particles are from your source. So the further a particle is away, once we start playing with power, we're going to see a fall off over distance. So let's just set this to 1. So keep your eye on this one up here. So again, no one's winning the race here. So let's come to our vortex node here, and now I'm going to take power and I'm going to change it to 1. Let's take a look what happens. Okay, now we're starting our animation. There we go. What I'll do is I'm going to just deselect this vortex node from down here so the control doesn't show up. Alternatively, I could come up here and I could unclick show controls, take that checkbox off. That would turn off the green thing. But let's just keep that on, and I'm going to just deselect everything. Okay, let's take a look at what's happening here. This inner circle is now much faster. This outer circle is now much slower. And that kind of makes sense because we've put a value in power. So what that means is there's a fall off over distance now. So everything that's further away from the center point here is going to be affected less by this pVortex node. So you can get a sense of how these two controls work in conjunction. Again, strength is sort of your overall strength, but if you have your power set to 0, you can go out to infinity away from your origin of your pVortex node, and you're still going to be affecting particles. When you start to introduce power, you're going to be introducing a fall off over distance. Now it's going to be a fall off over distance when the power is set to a positive value. If I set this to a negative value, which is completely valid, we're going to see over distance not a decrease in the effect of the pVortex node, but an increase. So what we would expect to see is, after I press enter here, is the outer circle to be winning the race. Let's do that now. And there we go. We see that outer circle sort of win the race. So that's all this power is doing, is determining how particles are going to be working over distance. So the further away you are, if you want those particles to be affected less, you want to use a positive number. So I crank that up to 5 and look how slow things are going on this outer circle. I can also put a negative number if I want things further away to be affected more. So it's pretty powerful. Sorry. Okay, so to keep things simple, I'm going to take that power, I'm just going to turn it back to 0 for now. Okay, so for now I just want to turn off this bottom instance here, so I'm going to come up here, I'm going to click on this little toggle switch here, and it looks like it's turned them both off. And that has to do with the order. It looks like that these are connected into the input. So I'm going to select this P merge, I'm going to hit Control T, and now we have this bottom instance that's off, and we have our P emitter that seems to be working just fine. So that's perfect for now. So let's dive a little deeper then into the vortex. So I select my vortex node again, and we come up here and we look at strength and power. We understand how those work now. Our translation, yeah, we're good with that. Now we have size, which is just the size of this control here. I'm going to leave size for now because there's a demo that I want to do outside of this sort of ring demo that might explain the size a little bit better. Now angle X and angle Y, what do these do here? Okay, well let's take a look at it. So let's start off with angle Y. So remember, Y is our vertical axis here. It's the green one. So what Y should do is sort of spin this ring around that. So let's start off with a value of 45 degrees, let's say. And we'll get all our views in order here, and there you can see that 45-degree angle from this top view. And we can spin it around to whatever we want, so 90 degrees or something. So that's all this is doing. It's just effectively rotating the effect of this vortex around that y-axis. And we're going to put that back to 0. Let's take a look at what X does, and we're going to do this in steps here. Okay, so we're going to start off by, I'm going to just do 10-degree steps. So I'm going to start off with 0, I'm going to change it to 10, and we see it kind of bowl over that way. So here's the x-axis, right? So you picture this vortex kind of rotating around that x-axis and kind of lying down in a sense. So let's just sort of take a look at what happens. Then we go to 20 degrees, goes over a bit more. I'm going to go right to 45. Okay, we see kind of shrinking down there. I'm going to go up to 60. Kind of got this weird shape here. We're going to go up to 80. Condensing down into sort of the original source and just sort of swirling things around there, and finally up to 90 degrees. So it's sometimes tough to really, I'm going to go back to 0 here. Sometimes it's tough to sort of visualize what that vortex is doing, and it's better just to sort of come in and play with these values and sort of get a real sense of kind of how things work. Okay, so let's take a look at some other things. So this control is kind of represented as a sphere for this vortex, but you know, what does that really imply? If I was to take this emitter down here and stretch it out along this axis, what's going to happen? Are the particles that are sort of out here, are they going to kind of wrap around? You know, what's going to happen? So to change that, we come down to P emitter, we come up to our region, and it's going to be the height. The height is going to control us in this axis. So we'll take that height, and I'm going to move it up to 1. Cool, very interesting here. So what do we got here? So it's tracing out this cylinder here. I'm going to add a few more particles just to fill that in a little bit. Pump this up to 20. Frame rate still looks pretty good. So that's pretty cool. And we can go as long as we want. So I move that up to 5, and now we've created this sort of big tunnel of particles that you sort of see here. So while this control kind of implies that things would sort of swirl around this, almost like a center of gravity, that's not how things sort of work in reality. We'll bring that height back to 0.1 for now. And things are a little bit slow. I'm going to go back to 10 particles per frame. Okay, so that's pretty neat, and you can see there's probably some value in this, right? There's a lot of things you can think of doing with sort of this ring of particles, but let's see what else we can do. Let's take our particle system, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this vortex node, I'm going to control C, Control V to make a copy of it. This is not an instance, and I'm going to put this in line again here. Let's take a look at what happened. Very cool. We got spirals. And again, the power of each of these is set to 0. It's just the strength that's been set to different values. So if I take that strength, I can play with that outer strength. So that's pretty cool. So take a look right here. See how things kind of stop right there? That just has to do with my lifespan of my particle emitter. So I'm going to come over to my particle emitter. I'm going to take my lifespan. I'm going to just crank it up to 500. So then when we swirl around, we're just going to sort of keep going until the end of the animation. Alright, so that's looking pretty cool. So I'm going to turn off our quad view for a second and just go to perspective. So we can sort of see things on the big screen, zoom out a little bit. Okay, so that's starting to look pretty cool. And you can kind of envision, if we put a bit of a directional force maybe or something on this, we can start to get a bit of a tornado kind of thing happening, right? So that's pretty neat, but let's take a look at this vortex from a bit of a different perspective. Let me reset some things here. Okay, so what I've done here is I've just kind of kept the same setup, but if you look down at my node tree here, I've just taken this P emitter and if you just look up at this viewport, I've changed the size to make it quite a bit larger than our vortex, because what I want to do is just sort of send up a whole bunch of particles and see what this vortex sort of looks like when it sits in the middle of a field of particles. I've also taken that second vortex that was giving us that spiral effect out of the chain, so it's just our P emitter and our vortex, so pretty simple setup. And right now our vortex is set up to have a strength of 2.38 and a power of 4. So on the right over here I have what it looks like from our camera's perspective, and then I have my 3D view here that we can kind of take a look at things. So first thing to notice is our camera is looking this way here, and we can see this kind of hole being sort of bored out, and that was sort of that cylinder that was being created, right? That's sort of the same thing that's happening. Right now our power is pretty high, which means our fall off is pretty high. So if you look at the particles up over on this side here that are just outside of this sort of sphere of influence, they're not really moving that much. So let me just take this perspective view and I'll put it into front view, and we can see that a little bit better here. So here's the size of our control, and because our power is fairly high, it's not really affecting particles that are too far away from that sphere. It's a little bit, kind of affecting these ones just outside, but the higher we move our power, the more we sort of constrict things to just this sort of sphere of influence. So if we take this power, for example, and we were to take it down to 0, now we're back to that kind of cylinder spiral thing that we were creating earlier. And this is pretty cool. You can kind of get sort of a wave effect or something, right? So that's pretty neat. But for now, let's put our power back up to 5. And I want to play with the size a little bit just to show you how this size sort of influences things. So if we come down to our size here, and the vortex is really only affecting particles sort of within the sphere. So when we increase size, well, we increase the area of effect as well, right? So, and our strength is pretty high, so we can bring our, let's play with our strength a little bit and see what that does. So right now our strength is, let's move it down to 1. We see we're not having quite as great an effect. Bring it down to 0.1. That's just a very subtle movement in the middle. And just for fun, let's crank it up to 10. And we start to see, okay, yeah, we got some pretty drastic effects here. So pretty neat control. There's almost nothing to change here. There's not a whole lot. Just these simple controls give you tons and tons of options if you take the time to sort of play around with things.